Okay, this reading is from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went, because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, "Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?" He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them." And then Simon, Peter's brother Andrew, spoke up, "There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd?" "Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we have been expecting." When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. That evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake toward Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them, and the sea grew rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat. They were terrified, but he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination.
There are 2 kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves. That's what Northwest University professor Dan McAdams says. For the past 30 years, he has studied how the stories that we tell about ourselves form and reform our identity. Stories are very important. We are all storytellers, even though our lives don't necessarily follow well-crafted story arcs. For example, Devin has been working full-time in a local business, and he'll come home each day with an outlandish story. Now, Devin doesn't share with us random anecdotes or statistics related to his day. Instead, he says, "Today's episode is entitled blank," and then he goes on to tell a story. Now, Devin's story includes details and includes basic information, but it comes in the shape of a story, and Devin's story tells us as much about him as it does about his day. McAdams says there's 2 kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves. These stories shape and are shaped by our own personal narrative. Our personal narrative identity. It's a sense of ourself that's constructed from story. He calls it a personal myth. Now, it's not a myth in the sense of like being a story that isn't true, but instead it's a myth in the sense that it's a story with heroes and with villains. It can be about the challenges that we've overcome in our lives or the suffering that we have endured in the past. And when we want to help someone understand us, we tell them a little piece of this story. This week, a friend of mine posted a link on YouTube. It's the most recent hot take on virology and maybe to a lesser extent politics. But what she said is, if you want to understand what I've been reading lately, take a listen to this. What she's saying is, this video, this is me. This video is a story that I'm using to help make sense of the world. And this is how we can be listening to the same news even and hearing the same statistics and coming to completely different conclusions. That's why this pandemic has such radically different interpretations. Our personal myth, our sense-making narratives highlight certain details and they diminish others. For some, the Delta variant is evidence that the vaccination program isn't working, and every story about people continuing to get sick confirms this detail. While on the flip side, others would point to the explosive growth of the Delta variant within communities that aren't vaccinated and say that that proves that vaccination's the answer. The same data, read two different ways, can confirm two completely contradictory stories. It's important to understand that a person's sense-making narrative is not an exhaustive story of everything that's ever happened to them. It's just simply a story that they use to interpret the little micro stories that are all around them. The stories that we listen to, the stories that we read, the mass media we consume, the social media that we surround ourselves, they all influence this sense-making narrative. Now today, in the story that Phyllis read for us, Philip sees a problem. You see, he's grown up in this neighborhood along the Sea of Galilee. He's familiar with the West Shore, and he knows it like the back of his hand, and he's never seen these hills so full of people before. It's exhilarating to see waves of people rolling over these hills all the way down to the seashore, and speculation is ripe amongst the apostles. This is a group that's large enough. This is a group that's large enough to push the Romans out of Capernaum. It's possibly even a group large enough to do some damage in Caesarea, but Philip's a practical man. He's skipped breakfast before, and sometimes he's even skipped lunch. But he's now looking at 5,000 men, besides women and children, that are about to go without breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, Philip knows Hanuman, the baker in town. And he also knows Keturah, who makes the best matzah that he's ever had. And both of them would have to bake round the clock for 3 days straight just to make a dent in what this group of people would likely eat. And who's going to pay for that? He's been warning Jesus all day to send the people away. We don't have enough food for these people. We don't have enough money to even buy it. This is Capernaum. There aren't enough markets within a half-day's journey to have enough food for all the people that are gathered here. For John, this isn't a feeding a lot of people story, though. John is telling us this story for a very different purpose. All 4 of the Gospels tell this story about the feeding of the 5,000, but John gives us a little insight into what's happening in the background. And to us, it might seem like Jesus is teasing Philip. Like, why would he say this? Maybe he's yanking his chain when he says, "Hey, Philip, where are we going to get all the bread?" What kind of a question is that? What's Jesus up to? Now, Jesus isn't a dummy. He's not being obtuse here. John tells us that Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He was, in fact, testing Philip. Jesus is setting up a lesson. Jesus is teaching his disciples something. Jesus is presenting them with a whole new story, a radically different narrative. McAdams says there's 2 kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves: redemptive stories and contamination stories. And they help shape and are shaped by our own personal myth. Now, for one person, for example, a childhood experience of learning how to swim by being thrown into the lake might explain why they've become an entrepreneur and have relied upon themselves and their own strength and learned how to take risks and how to take setbacks and stride, while another person with the very same experience might use that story to explain why they hate boats and why they don't trust authority figures. Philip sees a "we don't have enough bread" story here. We don't have enough money story. And Andrew joins in just after that with a different kind of story. Hey, here's a little boy's lunch, but that's not going to be enough. He sounds like Eeyore lowering the boom on Christopher Robin's picnic plans. There are 2 kinds of stories. Now about that, redemptive stories and contamination stories. Redemptive stories are stories that have hope. They have problems and challenges, but the storyteller feels like they have agency in the story. They feel like they're going to be able to do something about it, that they will be able to change the outcome. Redemptive stories are a faithful reminder that we've been here before. We've been in this situation before. God has been faithful before. Redemptive stories point beyond themselves to something else, to something greater. A contamination story, on the other hand, is where people interpret their lives as going from good to bad. I'm part of a Facebook group, a community group, that spends a lot of time telling variations on this story, that Beamsville used to be a town that was good, or a town that was small, or a town that was friendly, but now Beamsville is a town that is bad, or is too big, or is rude, or ignorant. I call it the complaining group because it's always variations on this same contamination story. What's wrong with people, they'll say. Oh, the mufflers on these cars, they're too loud. They drive too fast. It used to be a nice town, but now these new people, these other people have come into town and ruined it. These stories, contamination stories, they set boundaries and they establish expectations. We use these stories, redemption stories and contamination stories, to create coherence in our world. Our minds make meaning out of events in our lives, and we need meaning to function, and when something happens, we subconsciously connect it with what we already know. And big events, traumatic events, are sometimes big enough to even shift our personal myth, our sense-making narrative, one way or another. These stories are small, but they have a big impact. We'll say things like, "This always happens," or "I shouldn't have gotten married so young," or "My dad always tells me this," or "My mom never believed that." They're small stories, but they have a big impact on this sense-making narrative. This morning, John is telling us a story, but it's not his story. This is your story, right? The story of Jesus is your story. It's the story that Jesus is telling about you, your redemption story. Does it still help you find meaning, or is it being drowned out by the other narratives in your life right now, the other stories that you're hearing? Other, perhaps more urgent stories. Why is Jesus talking to Philip like this about the bread? John wants us to understand that Jesus isn't playing, that Jesus is teaching, that Jesus teaches us when he stretches us. It's absurd sometimes, his way of helping us learn. Jesus tells his disciples, "Have everybody sit down." And at this point, Philip's anxiety must have risen. For they're not sending them away now. That's become clear. And in fact, all the people are now with an expectation that something big is going to happen, something new, something fresh. Jesus is making it look like he's about to feed them. This is not going to work, Philip thinks. We don't have enough food. We don't have enough money. But Jesus is teaching. He's stretching his disciples. He's adding a story to the repertoire. Perhaps it's even a big story that might turn the tide or shift the thinking that people have. Jesus takes this poor boy's lunch. Yeah, what about that boy? What's he thinking right now? He thanks God for this small, simple meal. And then he breaks the 5 barley loaves up and the 2 salted fish, which would have represented a side to a small meal of bread. And then he starts to hand it out. Maybe he divided it into 4 and sent it 4 different directions. A small bit of bread and a half of a piece of fish. It would have been an interesting miracle, a curious miracle, if you will, because it would be hard to see where the 5 loaves ran out and where the miracle began. The people in the 5th row might not even realize what was happening at first. The food goes by and they all take their part, but not until the leftovers start getting collected up would they realize what had happened. Perhaps the people in the back had the best view. For the baskets would have been overflowing by the time they came to the back. And people would have said, "Oh, there's more than enough here. Send some of these back to the front where they only had a little bit." Only the disciples would know for sure. Only they knew the reality that had just taken place. We gave him a little bit, and Jesus has turned it into more than enough. We gave him what they had, what little food they had, and Jesus turned it into a feast. Now there's more than enough. Too much, in fact. When we don't have enough, God makes it enough. When we don't have enough, God has enough. God is enough. When I am not enough, God is enough. That's the story. That's our story. There are two kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves: redemption stories and contamination stories. And they have an incredible impact on our own personal myth, our sense-making story of the world, the network of narrative assumptions that we use to help make sense of the world. A contamination story tells us what's wrong, or tells us what's broken, or tells us what's missing. Contamination stories tell us that we can't, or that we don't. Contamination stories create outrage in our heart. They stir up anxiety and they motivate panic. When there's not enough, I'm going to hold on to what I have just a little bit tighter. I'm going to pull back and draw in resources and hold my breath a bit. When there's not enough food and when there's not enough money. Now, I'm not suggesting that these stories aren't sometimes true. But I am suggesting that there's another story that also fits the data. There's another story that also finds continuity with the facts, that's also grounded in the biblical narrative, in our story. John is reminding us of our story today here in John chapter 6. That Jesus' story is our story. That Jesus has called us into a better story. Now, you're listening to me for 20 minutes or so, once a week. But when you're listening to cable news about 6 hours a day, every day, which narrative do you think is going to have more traction in your life? What kind of story is cable news telling? What kind of story does your Facebook feed tell? Jesus takes our little and makes it more than enough. Jesus also reminds us that our story is still unfolding. It's not over yet. That God's not done with us yet. There is more to your story. This is why Christian community isn't so important. This is why spending some time grounding yourself in the biblical narrative, that's why it's so important. It shapes your personal myth. It shapes your sense-making story into something that's more cross-shaped, something that's more Jesus-shaped. There are two kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves, and Jesus will only be in one of them. That Jesus will not become their king on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Not that way, and not that kind of king. Jesus won't be a prop in their self-defeating contamination, I'm not enough stories. Jesus won't be part of our this is why I can't cope stories. Jesus is telling you this morning, bring me your inadequacy. Bring me your not enough. Bring me what you have and I can make it more than enough. If you're worried that you can't get the grades that you need for veterinarian school, bring Jesus what you have, and either he will make something for you, something even more fulfilling than that. Or you may realize that you can do better at school than you realize. Stop worrying about what you can't change and bring God what you have. If you can't see a way out of the hopeless situation that you're in, bring Jesus what you have. Invite a trusted Christian friend into your life and share with them the situation and pray about it. And they might be able to see something that you haven't been able to see. There may be a way forward that you just haven't been able to imagine. And a Christian friend might be able to help you with. And spend some time in God's Word, reacquainting yourself with the story, our story, that helps us make sense of this world.